After the basic configuration, the post-installation configuration is done, the next step in GRC configuration is to configure the connectors and the connector groups and connection types for the systems that are going to be part of your GRC environment. Now, before we do that, let us try to understand what is the importance of these connectors and connector groups and connection settings. Okay, and why do we need to do it? Okay, let's get some basic understanding of that. Now, let's go to SPRO, right? So when you go to SPRO and IMG and then governance, risk and compliance, then you go to common component settings, integration framework, and this is a place where you start defining what your connectors are and what the relationship between how these connectors are mapped to the connector groups and things like that. Now connectors are basically your RFC connections, okay? So which we already did so in the beginning. So we are not going to look into this, but what we try to understand is these two settings here, and then later on after that we need to come here to understand these two, okay, and this one also. But let's understand first maintain connectors and connection types. What do we do here, right? What does this contain? So let's execute. So the very first thing that you see is the connection type screen, right? Now when you select a connection type, right, let's say SA50 for example, or okay, and then you go to define connectors. We'll take a good quick look at this. So you have the target connectors. Your connectors, like I said, is your RFC connection. So you have to specify what systems, okay, in your environment are going to be part of this connection type. Okay, so now how are these, see by these entries coming, we'll see in a minute. And once you have that, connectors, and then you can add the connectors, and then if you go and then you don't have to do sub connectors though, but then you go to connector groups, right? Then you have a connector group here, right? Now in that connector group, let's say this, right? And then you go to assign connectors, you have logical grouping, and then if you see again, you can give you can assign the connectors to your connector group. Okay, so you have, okay, so the hierarchy here is you first have the connection type. Connection type will have the connectors defined under it, okay, and then you also have connector groups, right? And then in the connector groups you can assign the connector group to a group type, right? It could be a logical group or it could be an application area, depending on cross system group, depending on what your requirements are. Okay, now in the logical group you also assign the target connector and the connection type. Okay, now where are these entries coming from, right? And where are these entries applicable? Now if you remember when we activated the BC sets, right, so in SCPR 20 transaction code. Okay, so let's go and take a look at a couple of connection types here. Okay, now the first one that we looked at is, for example, rule set for SAP R3. Okay, now when you look at the log, what does this BC sets do? They bring in the rule sets for a particular system. Okay, so for example, this is an R3 rule set, SAP R3 ECC rule set. Okay, what does that do? So what does it have? You have the function ID, and then you have the connector ID, right? So where is the connector ID? Here. So connection type. Then if you look at what is the connector ID here, right? SAP R3LG. So if you look at the connector group, okay, you have the connector group there. Okay, the connector group is your connector ID. Okay, now if you scroll down, right, so you see you are the connector group here for this BC set, right? And okay, and this connector group basically, this BC set basically brought in the rule sets, the function ID and the rule sets for ECC environment. Okay, so this is one thing. So the connector groups, the connector connection type, the connector group, they all come from the BC set activation that you do. Okay. Now the other BC set that we did, let's take S4 HANA LG. Okay, let's take that. Now this one is related to S4 HANA and Fiori. Okay, so if you look at S4 HANA and Fiori both, S4 HANA app, and take a look at the log, okay, so if you look at this, right, again, you see the connector ID and then the connector IDs, and this BC set brought in the rule sets, function IDs and risk IDs and all for SAP HANA, S4 HANA and Fiori. Okay, so if you look at, like we saw earlier, and they're all part of the global rule set. Okay, so if you see here, it is part of the global rule set. Okay, and if you look, this is your risk IDs also. So these are related to your risk analysis ARA module. So the rules BC sets basically bring in your risk IDs, the function IDs, and the rule sets and everything else. Okay, so these are the permissions. Okay, and then if you look at, these are the transaction codes or actions as for HANA, but it will also have, because we activated the S4 HANA Fiori together, they should also have the Fiori apps. Okay, should be there. Okay, let's go up. See, this is an example. Okay, so this is an example of a Fiori app. Okay, so this BC set, as you see, has brought in Fiori apps as well as S4 HANA's transaction codes, and it also will bring in the OData services for those apps. Okay, and then like you see, you have the connector ID or logic connector group as for it. If you go to the end, the connector group, and you also saw that the risk IDs were part of the global rule set. Now similarly, if you go back and take a look at, let's say, let's take a couple of other rule sets. Let's say the basis one, right, which is related to this basis LG connected group. Okay, so let's take a look at the log, and this will have your basis related, okay, connector group and connector ID, and if you go down, you will see the same connector group here. Okay, now where are these transaction codes, risk IDs? If you look at the risk IDs, and it gives you the business processes also, right? So the entire your rule set that you will work with is here. Okay, if you look at the risk IDs and then the function IDs, okay, the conflicts, they are also here. And then even these risks are part of the global rule set. Okay. Now let's take a look at the just the S4 HANA one. Let's say S4 Fiori one and see what does that have. Okay. So let's go and see if we can see S4 Fiori. And if you look, it has all the Fiori function IDs, okay? And this is the connector ID or the connector group. Okay. Now, how and where are these used, right? So what you do, right? So in the SPRO configuration, what you do is you basically include the systems that you want to be part of that particular connector group, right? So if you go and assign connectors, you can add the connectors here. Okay, so this connector right now includes this system. Okay, so why do you need to include the connectors, right? What is the relation between connectors and the connector groups, or what do you call connection? Yeah, connectors and the connector groups basically. Okay, so the link here, the reason you need to do this, I use an appropriate connector group because if you go to NWBC, okay, and look at your function IDs, for example. Okay, go to setup. When you define the function IDs, right? So for example, let's take a basis one, okay? That's a more simpler one to understand. So let's take, you take the BS10 function ID and which is for security administration, click on open. You see this thing here, the SAP basis, SAP R3, SAP S4ELG. These are the connector groups that we just saw, okay? Say for example, SAP basis, right? So this is the description, right? So you see the description here, okay? Then you have SAP R3, which is the connector group for SAP R3LG logical group. And then if you look at SF4LG, S4ALG, this is for S4 HANA, okay, system. So these came from the BC set, this data that you're seeing here and this data that you're seeing here, you got this from the BC sets activation. So when you include the systems in this basis in these logical groups, in this connector groups, when you run the risk analysis reports, right? If you close this and you go and let's close this also. when you go and run the risk analysis report on user level or whatever, right? And you pick the system, okay? You will get, because there's only one target connector mapped to the launch groups, you get the system directly here. Okay, but here what you do is it will take the connectors, and then when you run the report, it is going to run the report on the connectors, right? So if you look at the global rule set, for example, right? Where is that rule set? Rule set here. You can pick the rule set here. Okay, so when you do, so what you can do is basically that you can define your own rule set. Okay, and then when you create your own risks or define your own custom risks, right? When you look at the risk ID, you also have to assign a rule set to that risk ID, okay? That's one thing. And also when you look at the function ID, right? If you look at, come here, let's pick one and say open. Here we saw, right? So what logical groups are associated with this, right? What the connector groups are. So when you run the risk analysis report, it is going to pick the systems from the logical groups, okay, the connector groups that you're seeing here, and then run the report on the systems that are part of that group, okay? Now, if I go and try to add one, so let me close and create. Okay, so when you see your system here, right, when you click on add, let me, just because it's a mandatory field, let me add something, okay? And then click on add here. See, you get the list of the connector groups, not the systems, okay? So wherever this function IDs that you create are involved, the risk analysis report will run for all the systems that are part of that particular connected group. Okay, so this is the importance of properly mapping or properly using the connector groups and the systems in that connectors. See, technically speaking, you can have individual connector groups, okay? You can just for S/4HANA, here you can just include your HANA connector. If you have a ECC system also involved in your environment for R3, you could put that. You know, in SAP R3 connector group, you can include your ECC system. Okay, you can also include ECC system and S/4HANA system in basis connector group. You can do, you know, whatever you want with this. The point is, function IDs are tied to the connector groups, and the connectors are tied to the connector groups. Okay, the connectors meaning your systems are tied to the connector groups. And because of all this mapping, when you run the risk analysis report, the system goes and picks up, the GRC system goes and picks up the target groups, target connectors from the connector groups and runs the report on those systems. Okay, so this is the importance of our relationship between connector groups, connectors, and connector connection settings, connection types basically. Okay. Now, next, what we'll do is we'll create our own connector group, connection type, connector group, and add our connectors to the system, okay, to that particular connector group. Okay.